A few days ago, Janet and I participated in an online meeting with all the different Southern California Civil War roundtables. And the plan is to have a meeting online every couple of months to discuss issues to help sustain and grow the different roundtables in Southern California. And we're hoping that the closure of the San Diego roundtable was due to unfortunate timing, and we're hoping to prevent similar bad things happening to the other roundtables. Orange County has been off by themselves, and we just got verification that they're really still meeting. But the other roundtables, West Valley, Los Angeles, and Inland Empire, are all having different issues. We're having issues, and we're hoping that by communicating more with each other, we can support each other and find ways around some of the problems that all of the roundtables are facing. I mean, everybody's facing problems because of the COVID restrictions, but a lot of the problems the roundtables we're facing are not because of that, but because of other issues. So we'll be reporting back to the roundtable here every couple of months if we learn anything that is of major significance, and we'll continue to post and put into the newsletter information about some of the other neighboring roundtables, their meetings, and information about Civil War related events that people might find of interest. And for those of you who came in late, there's information that will be coming out later this year about the preservation of the Owen Brown gravesite up in Pasadena. And when that is official and gets through the county machinery, I'll let you know, because there will be probably a couple of small programs, one of which will be at Mountain View Cemetery, where Owen's sister is buried. Ruth Brown Thompson and her husband Henry Thompson are at the cemetery along with their daughter. So there's going to be a memorial at Mountain View Cemetery highlighting the Brown family. And that should be put in one of the mausoleums later this year, hopefully before Memorial Day. They have to physically make a bronze plaque, but they've got it all designed apparently. So I will let people know when these things come up. And now I want to get started introducing things for the meeting, because tonight's speaker has been a speaker at several of the roundtables, and always on topics that are not necessarily the stuff that you hear just every day or you read about every day. Dave Schrader has given us talks, and the other roundtables talks, on the supply chain of the Civil War and on the infrastructure of the Civil War in various ways. And tonight's talk is about two of the men who not only helped Abraham Lincoln keep things going during the war, but helped document it so that everybody later would have some clue as to what really went on. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to turn things over to our speaker for tonight, Dave Schrader.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Let me make sure I get the slides up and the audio is okay. David, can you confirm, and I'll forward it?
Looking great.
Okay, so thank you very much. Last time I spoke with your group, I was standing on the stage in the auditorium, and we had a lot of technical difficulties there because Microsoft decided to reboot my system right as I was supposed to present. But we made it through that one. Hopefully tonight will be a little bit easier with no technical difficulties. So this is from the abstract that I sent out. The two secretaries were John Haye and John Nicolet. I'm going to cover where they came from, how Lincoln even knew them, what their responsibilities were, and how they did things. But my real goal is to tell you, and you're old enough like me, most of you, that you understand the Paul Harvey hook, which was, and now let's tell you the rest of the story. So my goal is to dig into some of the people and organizations that played supporting roles so that you can get a better idea. And hopefully at the end of this, you feel like you actually got enough information that you kind of know a little bit more about John Haye and John Nicolet and what happened to them. The primary sources here, both of these books are very good. There are several other books and there's a lot of online information. So I steal freely from all the sources I can find and try to weave it all together. Our first problem is going to be, what do we call these guys? Because they're both named John. So let's just call them what Lincoln called them. Nicolet got called Nico. So I'll probably refer to him throughout this as Nico. George was another one, and John Haye we'll call John. So how do we know that the information that I'm about to present is accurate? Well, the good news is John Haye kept a daily diary while Nico had a fiance back in Springfield and wrote 300 letters, and both of them were good writers. And so most of what we can see comes from quotes in their own words that have been compiled. My style will be to go pretty quickly through all of the pages of this. There are almost 100 slides. If you want a copy of this afterwards, I'll give you my email and I'm happy to send it to you so you can maybe go back over things that I went through a little bit more quickly. But you can read faster than I can talk. So for example, I hope that you've read the bottom yellow part, which is a quote from Nicolet. Okay, fair enough. So let's start with who are they and where do they come from? Nico is actually German, so his name is Johann Georg Nicolet and came from Bavaria. He was 28 in 1860. He lived to be 69. His family had moved to Cincinnati, and unfortunately, he was a bit of an orphan. His mother died in 1842. His father died in 1846, but fortunately for him, he had relatives in Missouri and in Pike County of Illinois. He was really quite frail. He was 5'10", but didn't ever weigh more than 125 pounds. He got picked on or bullied. He was a very smart young kid, and a Sunday school teacher helped him get a job with a retail merchant in a city called Pittsfield. I'll give you a map in a second. But by and large, he was self-educated. The retail job wasn't really using his smarts. So Nico asked the Sunday school teacher to help him get a different job with a newspaper. He became what's called a printer's devil, setting press, but eventually he ended up owning that paper and he ran it until he sold it in 1856. So he was great with words, and that was a skill that would be quite helpful later. Here on the map, you can see where Pittsfield is. It's only 70 miles away from Springfield. And when he moved to Springfield, he worked for the Illinois Secretary of State, a guy named Ozias Hatch. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But it was in Springfield that Nicolet met Abraham Lincoln when he was just 25 years old. Now, our other main character tonight, John Haye, is 6 years younger. He actually had a wealthier family. He was born in Indiana, and the family moved to Warsaw, Illinois. So going back to that map, you can see it along the Mississippi River north of Pittsfield. So both of them grew up not that far away from Springfield. By the way, up on the top there, that's my hometown in Sterling, Illinois. If any of you are from Illinois, between Rockford and Davenport on this map. His father was a physician and came from a pretty well-to-do family, but the grade school education in Warsaw wasn't that great. So he had a rich uncle named Milton who encouraged the family to send young John there. And while he was in Pittsfield, he did meet Nico. But at age 13, he moved to Springfield to attend Springfield College. So colleges back then allowed you to, it was more like high school. Ultimately, he was accepted by Brown in Rhode Island. Now, here you can see his big mustache. While at Brown, he enjoyed the college life, but he was viewed as a bit of a hick from the West. He wasn't that well prepared academically, but he was well liked. He was very social. He wrote poetry. He got a master's degree. And then he was headed towards being a lawyer. So he moved back to Springfield to clerk and lawyer with his uncle, who had moved his practice to Springfield. And it was while he was clerking in 1859 and 1860 that he met Lincoln, because his uncle's office was right next to Lincoln's office. So that's how the three of them came to know each other. Now, why did Lincoln start depending on them as his right-hand guys? Well, it turns out back in the 1850s, not unlike now, the political practices were very partisan. Newspapers were extremely partisan. And unlike now, the politicians didn't get out and do their own electioneering. They pretty much stayed home, wrote a lot of correspondence, and they kind of had their advocates pull the strings to try to get them nominated in the convention. So there was a lot of newspaper coverage, some of it planted. So if you had helpers who were good writers, that meant that they could ghostwrite a lot of the inputs on the issues. So Lincoln actually hired Nico before the election in 1860 to deal with the amount of correspondence. And here you can see what Nico wrote to his fiancée, Therina Bates. He was happy. He got paid $75 a month to be Lincoln's secretary, and he has a room in the State House, and so he didn't even have to move anywhere in order to stay in Springfield and take on that job. Typically, he would sit in the corner. Lincoln would let him go through all the letters and figure out which ones needed Lincoln's attention. A lot of them were well-wishers, nothing required, but the number of letters went up and up and up. And we know all of this because his daughter, Helen, wrote a nice biography of Nico. She never married and ended up dying in 1954. So that feels like kind of a not far in the distant past kind of connection with Nico. So he was happily working for Lincoln before he got the nomination. And then the very first thing that Lincoln did was to officially appoint Nico to be his personal secretary. Now, up until 1857, the president had to pay for that out of his own salary. But Congress had decided that they would pay for one government paid secretary for the president. So that was one of his first acts in office. And the job that Nico was taking on would be two things: to run Lincoln's calendar and to handle his correspondence. Now, actually, you needed more help because you had the goal of passing legislation. There were a lot of other things going on. In addition to the Civil War, we'll talk about that. So Nico convinced Lincoln to add John Haye to the staff as an unpaid helper, because rich Uncle Milton would pay his salary for the first 6 months. And then they figured out how to make John Haye a military secretary, even though that wasn't really what he was doing. So that was it. Lincoln and his two helpers. You might ask, by contrast today, how many people work in the executive office of the president? And the answer is, just in the West Wing, 400 to 500 full-time equivalents. But in the official executive office, including policy experts, there are now 1,800 people that are driven by the executive part of the government, with a budget of $714 million. So many of the things that are being done today clearly are more complicated, but it's kind of interesting that just two people did a lot of the work for Lincoln. Now, how well did they do their jobs? Well, it turns out that Nico was, well, pretty German. I'm German. So his nature was well suited to the difficult job, because people hated him because they couldn't use him. And the quote there by a third secretary that got hired along the way, William Stoddard, was, they hate him because, most people would be hot-tempered given what they had to put up with, but Nico just did his job and, made sure that only the people that merited Lincoln's time actually got it. So here's a screener. Think of it that way. By and large, he was dubious of most people's objectives. So there were a lot of patronage jobs at the time, and so he had to screen them. Now, One thing that you might not know about the White House is there weren't a lot of security guards and the bottom floor was wide open. So all these people that thought that they needed to see Lincoln would congregate downstairs and hope that they would get invited up the grand staircase. And I'll show you the layout of things in just a second. Here are a few things that you'll find fun to read about Nico. I won't read it all to you, but it's like, it's basically, he must be seen, you know, every visitor shall be seen. And he thought 95% of the people did not really need to see Lincoln at all. Just for fun, he wrote this: has not the Honorable Jonathan Swellhead come all the way from Wisconsin to talk to Lincoln about the draft quota? Or the Reverend Dr. Blowhard traveled 1,000 miles to convince Lincoln to increase the number of fast days? Or Christopher Carbuncle needs a job running the post office? Or Samuel Shoddy came from Boston to get a blanket contract? Or a committee from a church came to nudge the idea of prayers opening every cabinet meeting? So you can get an idea of his sense of humor and wit just from some of these writings. Now, John Haye's job was not to guard the visitors or run the appointment calendar. It was to write editorials and shape public opinion. And this is where his Brown education, as well as his social skills at charming politicians, came to bear. So both of these guys saw them, the literary flair came from John Milton. Okay, so a lot of press relations. He ghost wrote a lot of editorials. He had a pretty outgoing personality that most people really, really liked. Lincoln treated him like his surrogate son. In the dark days for Lincoln, Haye was the court jester. Some other people, though, were less impressed by him and thought he was kind of a smart aleck. So I like the quote: Haye was smart and he knew it. He was attractive to young women and he knew it. He was witty and he knew it. So not everybody was impressed by John Haye, but I think you get the sense that his social skills helped out with his part of the job. Lincoln also loved reading, good writing, theater, poetry. And so late at night, a lot of interactions happened between John Haye and Lincoln. Now, one interesting aspect is some people have used computer technology to take a look at Haye's style, which is interesting, kind of long sentences, some verbal pyrotechnics, different tones, offbeat adverbs, scornful adjectives, and applied all of that to something called the Bixby Letter. So I'm assuming that most all of you Lincoln fans have seen that. Let me make it a little bit interactive. What film featured the Bixby Letter as a part of the plot line? You want to come off mute?
I have everybody on mute. Let me
Oh, that's okay. You can guess. I just wanted to make it a little bit.
Saving Private Ryan.
Saving Private Ryan would be true. Even at the time it was written, they actually put it out to the press, and it was very popularly received in the North. However, the reality of this, if you look, is that Lydia Bixby was a Southern sympathizer, and she didn't really care for Lincoln. She kept the House of Ill Fame in Boston. She purportedly destroyed the letter after she got it. She lost 2 or 3 sons, not 5. But for our purposes, the letter was probably written by John Haye. And that's from a stylistic perspective. And also the fact that Lincoln really did not read or write very many letters. So you can see the quote from John Haye to Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon. And some people sworn to secrecy said that John Haye admitted to them that he was the one who wrote the Bixby Letter. So it's plausible, not provable, but just a little bit, if you admired that prose, it could actually have been from John Haye, not from Lincoln. Now here's the second story at the White House. And if you look on the left, that's pretty much the private quarters where Mary Lincoln and the kids and the president would have lived. You can see the grand stairway there. And then you see these rooms, which are now called the Lincoln bedroom, the Lincoln sitting room, the Queen's bedroom, and the Queen's sitting room. And at the time, if you wanted to see Lincoln, you came up those stairs. And John Haye's office was the Queen's sitting room. The Lincoln sitting room, I think, was Nico's office. The Lincoln bedroom was actually Lincoln's private office. And the Queen's bedroom is where the two secretaries slept. So they were together in the same room. So this is what Haye's office looks like today to give you an idea of how big it is. There was a third secretary. The workload included things like the president had to sign land patents. There was a lot of land, people moving west. And so Stoddard took care of that. They thought it would be healthy for Lincoln to get a daily digest and read out of newspaper articles, but he never found time to even spend an hour on it. So they gave up on that. But he did help with other things like drafting or making copies, because they had to do everything by hand back then. So he was the third secretary. Here's what the White House looked like on Inauguration Day in 1861. Like I said, anybody could come into the White House, so it was pretty crowded. And part of the problem that they had downstairs was that people wanted souvenirs. So people would come to the White House, and while they were waiting, since they didn't have much else to do, they would just start grabbing things like pieces of the carpet. One Army officer who was supposed to prevent that stuff actually gave his penknife to a couple of ladies who started carving up the brocade on the East Room chairs. So he got prison time and they were let off. So basically the White House downstairs was pretty much in shambles. Now, I'm going to talk about the Civil War aspects and the secretaries, but above and beyond the Civil War, there were a lot of non-war pieces of legislation that were going on. So one of the first ones, which happened in 1861, 63, and 64, is more states were joining the Union. So if we were doing this face-to-face, I would give you a quiz question of what 3 states were added during Lincoln's term. David, do you want to be my surrogate at guessing?
Actually, it would be Nevada, West Virginia, and I can't think of what a third one would be, but it should be at least those 2.
Kansas.
Oh, okay. Should
Okay.
have gotten that one.
Okay, good. Second thing that was going on was this connection to these schools and quite a few other ones. I went to Purdue in Indiana. Can you guess what that connection is? In 1862, what was happening?
I'm going to let everybody unmute themselves as well. And there, if you want to be able to unmute yourself, I don't have an answer for this one. So I'm opening that up to anybody else that may have it.
Land grant colleges.
Land grant.
That's right, the Morrill Act of 1862, and that also gave us ROTC. So every state was given land to sell so that they could build A&M schools, agriculture and mechanical arts. In 1863, that was when the Transcontinental Railroad was happening. Lincoln participated in the easternmost terminus, and then there were a lot of shady land dealings once the route was established. So a lot of politicking for where the route was going to go. Some of the route was driven by geography, but a lot of it was driven by politics. And if you could buy land along where the railroad was going to go, or if you got insights from your politicians, you could make a lot of money. Number 4 was the Yosemite. Lincoln signed an act starting to preserve some of the natural wonders. So he gave the Yosemite Valley to the state of California. So those are just 4 things that were happening that didn't have anything to do with the Civil War per se, but that kind of legislation was making its way through Congress too. Okay, how are we doing? Audio okay? Speed okay?
We are doing okay. I think what I'm going to do though is I'm hearing a little bit of flutter on your audio, and I'm going to ask everybody just to shut their video off. I'm going to do that on mine as well. I think it may help, but so we'll leave your video on, but turn everybody else's off though.
Okay. Okay, great.
Okay.
So I want to tell you a few secretary stories, and we'll do it year by year. So in 1860, pre-election, actually, Nico was looking at all of the well-wishing letters that were coming in and noted that, gee, there are a lot of people that think that, he could die. There are a lot of people out there that, are unhappy with the president or the politics, and the partisanship was very, very high. And so while there were a lot of popular sympathy, were his words for it, there were some number of letters that said, watch out for yourself because not everybody is friendly these days. In 1861, there was a lot of squabbling after he got elected because he had the power to give government jobs out to people. So here's a letter from Nico back to the Secretary of State, and it had to do with who got to run the post office in Springfield, which was a pretty important role. I like Nico's comment here. There were a lot of people fighting for it, mostly all men, and they decided that they would give it to the woman candidate. And he felt like the president would be pleased to have the riddle of the postmaster resolved in that way. What he did not put in there was what's the connection between Mrs. Lizzie Grimsley, who ended up coming and living in the White House for a while, because not only did she know Mary Lincoln, she was her cousin. So patronage was patronage back then as much as today. In 1862, we all know about McClellan. Here's a note from Nico to John Haye. The treadmill goes around as usual. The president keeps poking sharp sticks under little Mac's ribs, and he screwed up his courage to the point of beginning to cross the Potomac today. And both of them had pretty strong opinions. I'm not sure that they shared them with Lincoln, but about some of the generals along the way. In 1863, the Union needed more people, so they instituted a draft, which caused some riots in New York City. You could buy a substitute. So Nico actually paid $500 to hire John Staples as his replacement. Here's another one of these. I must see the president. Today it was a bunch of, I don't know what cold water men and women are, but it was temperance speeches. So the three blue-skinned damsels personified love, purity, and fidelity in their red, white, and blue gowns. And there were a few invalids there. And basically they said intemperance was the cause of all the Civil War defeats, but Lincoln's reaction was the rebels drank more and worse whiskey than we do and do just fine. So they headed off to their dinner of cold water and green apples and then mulligrubs. I didn't know what mulligrubs were, so I looked it up. And you can see it's, I think it's a gripping of the intestines. Not good. Here's, I think, the only picture of the three of them together, and this is a few days before the Gettysburg Address. That picture colorized is used on this page. Haye was quite impressed, even though Lincoln clearly had his ups and down days, calls it. And you can see the colorful writing. He's like a backwoods Jupiter, wielding the bolts of war and the machinery of the government with a steady hand. And because of Nico dining in the hotels, he actually interacted with a lot of the congressmen and could provide feedback or test ideas for Lincoln. So a very useful skill to have. As I mentioned before, they all lived on the upper floor of the White House. And so I think Lincoln did not sleep well if he got up and needed somebody to talk to or somebody to divert attention from the problem of the day. Haye was his guy. So they would occasionally dine together, go riding together, provide entertainment. Also, Haye was Robert's good buddy and social companion when he came from Harvard back to the White House. And their relationship became very important later on Another interactive question. Does anybody know why?
And your microphones can be unmuted. My wife is commenting from the other room, publishing of their memoirs.
That would be accurate. Give her a gold star. Okay. Lincoln actually wanted them to get out of Washington occasionally. Nico, as I said, was pretty frail. And so later on, you'll see what he did to try to help him out health-wise. He thought it would be good for Haye to go to Florida and help sell the 10% plan. So this was an interesting maneuver on Lincoln's part to offer amnesty during the war to Southerners if they would swear a loyalty oath and agree that slavery was illegal. And any Southern state that had 10% of all of their voters, 10% of the people that voted in 1860, they could form a new state constitution. It had to outlaw slavery, but that was a way for him to undermine the morale of the South, and also coincidentally would give him delegates for the 1864 convention. So a lot of politicking going on here, obviously. So he decided to send Haye. There was just one big problem of sending Haye to Florida. He was too young. So the initial feedback from this guy, who happens to be General Quincy Gilmore, commanding the Department of the South, was he's too young. So Lincoln made him a major and sent him down there. But the feedback was he held the president's letter of introduction in a helpless sort of way, like a bachelor with a baby. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. So that didn't work out that well, and Haye went back to Washington, D.C. Moving on to 1864, there was a fire in the stables that killed 6 horses, including the president's horse and the secretary horses and Tad's 2 ponies. They're gone where the good horses go, and Tad was unhappy because one of them was his dead brother Willie's horse. The guy in charge of the stables thought that it had been arson, that it had been fired. And part of the reason for that is Mrs. Lincoln fired her coachman. So she had someone that would take her around town. And Bob Cooper thought that he might have said it intentionally. Hold that thought. We'll get back to Mary Lincoln in a couple of slides. Whoops, I went backwards. One of the routine things was for Nico, requests for clemency. So in this case, the White House and the president fielded a request from this private in the Iowa cavalry that was supposed to be executed for desertion. And so instead of granting it, Nico had the job of interacting with Rosecrans to find out more information. Rosecrans wrote back that this guy from Iowa deserted numerous times. There were no extenuating circumstances. So rest in peace, David Mills. In 1865, Nico wrote to his fiancee that Inauguration Week is over. So of course the downstairs is now totally filled, or will be, with people coming in like Egyptian locusts looking for the patronage jobs. The president won't give them much encouragement, and because it's so expensive to get a hotel in Washington, D.C., they will run out of money pretty quickly and we will be rid of them. As I mentioned, the president was looking out for Nico. So he got confirmed as consul to Paris. The salary, unlike his first job for Lincoln at $75 a month or $900 a year, was going to be $5,000. But he wasn't going to start that job for 2 or 3 months. So he wanted to get married and take her along to Paris. Now, note the date here is March of 1865, and you know what happened in April. Nico was told in early April that the Assistant Secretary of State needed to go to Cuba, and the president asked if Nico could go along. Otherwise, he's working himself to death. So the idea was to give him kind of a mini vacation. But that meant that Nico was actually on the way. He was in South Carolina at the time of the assassination, notified. So he turned around and came back to Washington, D.C. Nice writing here. It would seem that Providence had exacted from him the last and only additional service and sacrifice he could give his country, that of dying for her sake. So expected him to become a martyr. By contrast, John Haye was in Washington, D.C. In fact, he got invited to go to Ford's Theater on the night of the tragedy, but he stayed in the White House drinking whiskey with his buddy Robert Lincoln. And when they heard that the president had been shot, they immediately went to Peterson House, and Haye was in the room and was present when he died. Let's talk about the women in their lives. Who do you think was the most important woman? That would be Mary Lincoln. So Mary had a rough time when she arrived. The Southerners thought she was a traitor. The Northerners thought she was treasonous. If she entertained and spent any money to do what she thought the First Lady should do, she was unpatriotic and it was all extravagant. But on the other hand, if she didn't entertain, like after the death of her son, then she's shirking her social duties. So you could always find a reason to hate Mary Lincoln, is my take. Her early mission, when she walked in the White House, now that I've told you earlier, the state of affairs in the downstairs, she and her sisters looked around and, they could see a lot of problems. So the carpeting was worn, people had ripped up the draperies, there were basement rooms that had rats in them. The whole place had the air of a rundown, unsuccessful, third-rate hotel. And it must be the case that Congress people noticed that too, because they gave her an appropriation of $20,000, which was quite a bit of money back then, to refurbish the White House. So she went to New York and she started buying stuff, and included a carriage and carpets and furniture and drapes and a dining service, pretty expensive dining service and glassware. And so she felt like she was doing her job. There was only one little problem. She, we'll get to that after one more slide. I'll give you a second to read this page. So she had made a lot of purchases and done a lot of work. The problem was she blew the budget. She not only spent the $20,000, she went over budget by $6,700. And when Lincoln found out about it, he said he's not going to approve the bills for what she did, and he would just pay it out of his own pocket. And Mary's view was they didn't really have the money to do that. So that's why she went on a campaign to fire the steward, fire her coachman, going back to that stable episode. She would do the work herself to run the cooks and the servants. She worked with the gardener to pad the official expenses. So basically, she did everything she could to save money, but she had run-ins all the time with the two secretaries. Anybody want to guess why that's the case?
And everybody does have the opportunity to be able to unmute themselves, and so I'm going to give other people a chance to be able to chime in here. And I've seen that you've unmuted yourself there and no comment.
They wouldn't cook the books?
They own the budget for the White House. They shared it. So she had to go through them in order to pay the things that she wanted to do. And a lot of the times they did not get along. So she was in an uncomfortable position, and it gets even worse. So one of the responsibilities is to host dinner parties, official dinner parties, New Year's parties. And it wasn't just the expense, it was who do you invite? Let me not jump ahead. So John Haye's view was they started calling her the Hellcat. And Mary basically asked John Haye to give her the salary of the White House steward who she'd fired. And here's this young guy that refused. I told her to kiss mine. He told Nico, was I right? And then she's in a state of mind, she's going to blackguard me. The Hellcat is getting more Hellcatical day by day. So their relationship was rather strained. And then Nico often was involved in the official invitation list for some of the parties. And so they had code words in their writing, which you can easily figure out who it is. But anyway, she wanted to snub some people. She had run-ins with some of the wives of some of the senators. So she wanted Rhode Island and Ohio to be off the list for a New Year's celebration party. And Nico was going to have none of it politically. And so he said, she went off the rails, and now I'm taboo again. But she eventually got over it. I don't know if you guys know Judge David Douglas. There's a picture coming up of him. He rode the circuit with Lincoln when he was a lawyer. Lincoln could ride on his horse across creeks, but David Douglas could not. You'll see why in just a second. But that judge was the executor of Lincoln's estate, and he got a few bills after Lincoln died. So a $2,000 invoice for a ball gown, for years, she had refused to pay for 300 pairs of kid gloves. So that gives you an idea of Mary's interaction. It turns out in 1866, she bumped into, or Mary is back in Springfield, but in Washington, D.C. was her chief housekeeper, or I think it was called, what was it? Housekeeper here. Talking to a senator from Illinois who wrote in his diary that she needed money because Mary had appropriated all of her money and she was penniless. So they called it a stewardess at the White House. There's the term I was groping for. So that's Mary Todd. Let's talk about the other women in their lives. So his fiance back in Springfield fielded 300 letters. They did marry in 1865, did go to Paris. His daughter, Helen, is the one that wrote a biography of his life, and he also had a son. This is where I was commenting before. She lived to be quite old and died in 1954. So she was pretty good at writing. There's a whole book on Nico that she wrote. John Haye married very well. He married a daughter of a very wealthy railroad magnate called Massa Stone. She was 17 years younger. And when he courted her, the mother was opposed because she didn't want her daughter to leave Cleveland for New York City, but they did end up marrying. The father gave them the equivalent of $190,000 in today's dollars as a wedding gift. They lived the good life, so they were part of high society and lived part of the year in New York, part of the year in DC, part of the year in Europe and in Cleveland. To give you an idea of how wealthy they are or were, in 1883, both John and Nico were living in Washington, D.C. John and his wife bought a $50,000 house back then, a 12,000 square foot mansion, while by contrast, Nico lived a quarter mile away and spent $5,400. So they ended up having 4 children. How do they shape the opinion afterwards? Well, here's Judge Davis, and you can see why he needed to be not on a horse going through the circuit, but instead in a carriage over bridges. he was the executor of the state. After Lincoln died, Robert Lincoln asked the secretaries to delay their trip to Paris to pack up all the documents and organize them. So there were 18,000 documents and quite a few boxes. And Robert put them in a bank vault and refused to let anybody look at the papers, even though the law partner Herndon was writing a biography. Now, William Herndon basically was trying to do a good job, but his job was kind of tough because Mary hated him because he told stories like the Anne Rutledge story and that Lincoln only loved one woman. And you can imagine how that went down with both Mary and, for that matter, Robert. So here are a couple of quotes. William Herndon's making an ass of himself. You know, this is in return for all my kindness to you. And you were, you know, a drug or drunk person, basically. So that was the first biography that came out. Then there was another one by Ward Layman. And so Herndon handed off some of the contents for what he had planned to do to another person who got together with another person as a ghostwriter. And their biography, it'd be interesting to try to get my hands on these, but the judge basically caused an entire chapter of that one to be deleted, and both Haye and Robert Lincoln tried to stop publication of it. So the general view is they were 0 for 2 on accurate biographies after Lincoln's death. So by 1874, by not coming out with a more official biography of Lincoln, the focus was on a variety of other things, you know, whether he was an atheist or was his mother a bastard, was he a bastard? So there, without access to the papers, you couldn't really do anything. So that's where the friendship that they had with Robert Lincoln paid off, because he allowed them to publish Lincoln's materials. The problem was they didn't start until, I think it's on the next page, 1875. And it took them 15 years to write it. And ultimately it was 10 volumes. And then there were another 12 volumes published later. So they were very meticulous, very thorough. They had access to all the source material, so they could do a good job. It's just there was a lot of source material. They also disagreed on the writing style, which is interesting if you've ever co-authored anything with anybody. By 1885, after 10 years, they were only halfway through, and they were already at 500,000 words, and only halfway through the Civil War. So Nico was very thorough and wrote long, and Haye wants brevity, and I love the comment, nobody's going to read this thing. So they ran everything by Robert Lincoln, but I think they were both getting a little bit tired, and they also both had other jobs, so it was a part-time writing assignment. So the way that this thing got nudged to a conclusion is that this magazine, the Century Illustrated, the publishers gave them financial incentives to finish the writing of the biography by serializing it. So they gave them royalties, and it turned out that Haye needed money because he had another new mansion and needed to buy stuff for it. And Nico wanted to buy some property in Colorado and New Hampshire. So that nudged them to the finish line. What happened to them afterwards? Well, John did, as I mentioned before, get appointed to be the consul in Paris. He ended up coming back after 4 years and having a couple kids to the United States, and lived in Chicago and edited the newspaper there, The Republican. And then for a good 17 years, he got a job as the Marshal of the United States Supreme Court. And then you can see overlapping that interval, he was writing, and then he also wrote one other side book. He became the Marshal of the United States Supreme Court because guess who was the head of the Supreme Court? David, the judge. So even Robert Lincoln wrote a letter of recommendation to Justice David Davis, and put in a good word for him. But I think everybody already knew Nico, so it was a good appointment. It turns out the job was not that difficult. He wrote to the guy who'd been the Secretary of State. They gave him the first job there in Springfield. Who said, "Hey, I got this job. It's $3,500 a year. The work is pretty easy. Basically, he just needed to keep the paperwork for the Supreme Court in order." So he viewed it as a very easy job compared with what he had been doing. The end of life, you can see here a picture of Nico with his daughter who's sitting on the couch. He had to resign. He lived with her in Washington, D.C., and is buried in Washington, D.C. So that's what he looked like near end of life at 69. John Haye continued. He was 6 years younger. He had a very long and distinguished career. He too was in Paris, and then he became an editorial writer for the New York Tribune. So lived in New York. I told you he lived all over the place. Then he returned to government and became an Assistant Secretary of State, Ambassador to Great Britain, Secretary of State under 2 more presidents, and was fairly involved in a lot of the political negotiations for ending the Spanish-American War, opening up China, and was involved in the Panama Canal. So he had quite the life. There's a nice biography of him that's out there too. There are 2 sad stories about him. His very, very rich father-in-law, the railroad guy, bridge builder guy in 1883 was, worth $100 million. He committed suicide by gunshot because in 1883, one of the bridges failed and 92 people died in Ashtabula, Ohio, when it ran off the tracks. And he had other business failures. As I mentioned earlier, Haye had 4 children. One of them, his son Adelbert, went to Yale, got appointed consul to South Africa. And it's a little unclear what happened, but he was in an upper story of a hotel in New Haven, which is Yale, and fell out the window at age 24. And you can see Haye's comment. People think that probably there was some drinking involved and it was very hot. So he went to the window to get fresh air, fell asleep, and then probably fell out the window and didn't even wake up doing it. Haye served in office until his death. He actually was leaving for a few days of summer vacation at his summer home in New Hampshire and died there of heart complications and got buried in Cleveland. So from start to finish, that's the life of both Nico and John Haye. Here's a good summary by Doris Cairns that you can read. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a feel. If you would like a copy of the PDF for this talk, you can jot down my Gmail account information. So it's just my name, Dave Schrader, with DR in front of it. That's kind of my stage name when I do my sports analytics talks for college kids. So I'll turn that around almost immediately if you want a copy of the talk. So it's drdaveschrader@gmail.com. As I mentioned before, if you like to read, I know most of you probably have pretty substantial Civil War libraries. These are the 2 books that I found the most interesting. There are a lot of online sources and other books that you could read. So I like this bottom one. Mr. Lincoln's whitehouse.org has a lot of interesting stories in it. So if you're interested in more details on any of these things, you'll find that I pulled information from it, but there's certainly a lot more. So Mr. Lincoln's White House is great. A variety of other books here. I'm sure more will come out. Just It's a fascinating topic. You can see there the John Haye book, All the Great Prizes. So that one's a good one. Thank you for listening. We'll open up for questions. I have been doing a lot of these talks, so I think these were the first 7 of them. This talk happened to be number 6. Last week for the Inland Empire, I did the Commissary and Quartermaster Corps talk, 2 above that. But you can see a variety of topics. I started with the Signal Corps. The second talk, which I almost have to do the first 2 face-to-face because I do the signal flags and then I do encryption. So you have to sit in pairs and decrypt the coded messages that I put out for you. But like I said, the Lincoln Secretary talk is a pretty good one. I did one on the diplomats over in Europe, trying to cultivate or prevent relationships, in the case of the North, preventing the South from being recognized. And I headed into the fire eaters and the abolitionists to get an idea of who the leading lights were on each of those. And looks like I have that one in there twice. And then the more recent talks have been on the congressional helpers, the Committee on the Conduct of the War, one on the Transcontinental Railroad. And the last one that I did was on West Point and the Mexican-American War, and in particular, all of the connections. So many of these generals knew each other beforehand, but I wanted to catalog who knew who and how they knew each other. And then the talk that I'm working on next will be on Beast Butler, which you probably know from his treatment of women who spit on officers when he was the controlling officer for the North in New Orleans. So that will be the next talk for my home Civil War talk in June. So that covers all of that, and I will stop the sharing and we can go to questions. And I think we have plenty of time left. I wanted to do it in an hour, and I think I made it in 51 minutes.
Well, Dr. Dave, thank you very much for your presentation. That was terrific. I did allow everybody to be able to unmute themselves. I also allowed them to be able to share their video if they want to. We do have a couple of questions that have come through for the chat already, so I'll start reading those. If you do have a question, feel free to be able to, like I said, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask the question to Dr. Dave directly, or that you can post it in the chat if you'd like me to be able to read it. So the first question that we have there is from Janet. She says, it's a great program. Dave, how would you, how and why did you choose to research this story?
Well, I read a lot, and so if I read the Civil War magazines or if I'm just browsing online, something comes to mind. It's pretty eclectic. There is no master plan. As I find a topic that I find interesting and I start digging into it, I think my only criteria is because all of you collectively know a huge amount about the Civil War. So if I can tell you like 3 or 4 things that you didn't already know, then that's success. But I tend to enjoy the people's stories and hopefully the ideas that you kind of get to know a little bit about the other people that maybe aren't the prime characters, the generals or the well-known politicians, for example. And there were a lot of other people behind the scenes. Today, while I was reading some stuff, it was like, what was the salary of Lincoln back then? And the answer is $25,000. But then I found an article that talked about the financing of the Civil War. And we all know the difference between the North and the South, but there's a lot of interesting financial stuff. I don't know if it would be interesting to you, but I was starting to read it and I was like, no, I need to get ready for this talk. So I picked this one partly because I'm from Illinois. These people were from Illinois. They were relatively young. I wanted to know, why did Lincoln trust them so much? There probably were a lot of more seasoned people around that he could have picked. What was the connection that caused him to pick them? So hopefully now you know the reason.
David, I see that you've got your hand up there if you want to go ahead and ask a question.
Yes. It's not so much a question, but I think an amusing incident about Haye that I read about in a book about Teddy Roosevelt's cabinet, where he was Secretary of State. And he was meeting one day with the Chinese ambassador, whose name was Wu, W-U. And you could sense his sense of humor because he wrote in his diary, after much discussion over several hours, woo was hazy, Haye was woozy, and that's how he left it.
A good one.
And so I thought that would be a good thing to share. They also mention in the book that often in cabinet meetings, when things became intense, he would sometimes pull a trump card by saying, well, when I was Lincoln's secretary, we yump, and that sort of shut everybody up.
Yeah, yeah. I think in times of crisis, you have to keep a sense of humor. And my general sense is that Haye provided that for Lincoln. Just a side comment, last week, I gave the commissary and quartermaster talk. And for some reason, the questions at the end of it centered on horses, which was fine. But I ended up, while I was looking for the answer to one of the questions in a book while people were wrapping up, I found another good Lincoln comment, which was apparently a Union general got captured along with a bunch of mules. And when they told Lincoln that fact, he said, well, I don't care about the Union general. I can make another Union general in 5 minutes, but those mules cost $200 each. Okay, next.
Any other comments on the audio, or otherwise I'll read another one from the chat here. All right, let me go ahead and read another one in the chat. Actually, there was one commentary, and just wanted to be able to mention this. The question and the comment was actually responded to directly, asking if your presentation from last week was recorded. And then Mike Hoover actually responded to that and said, yes, it was. It's available on the Roundtable Facebook page. So if you are interested in seeing that presentation, you should go there to be able to do that. Peter is asking a question in that Mr. Haye wrote many responses to letters on Lincoln's behalf. How much do we know about the contributions of the official speeches? It was mentioned that Mr. Haye wrote the initial draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. What about the other speeches?
I have no idea, but I bet if I pull the book out, the Haye book that I referenced there in the bibliography, it would probably have the answer in it. It's just I wrote the material for this talk like 2.5, 3 years ago. So I honestly, off the top of my head, don't remember, but
okay.
That book undoubtedly would have more of the detail from a Haye perspective of what he did and didn't do.
Another question asking in relationship to some of your other presentations, are the slides from the Mexican War and the Civil War talk available?
Oh, they're all available. Just shoot me a note if you want to see them. Or we're going to have an interesting thing. Nick earlier talked about the meeting that we had a week ago Monday of all the different Civil War groups. And I think part of the advantage or disadvantage, depending on your vantage point, is that the program chairs will now have the wider list of who's presenting. So I seem to have become a known quantity now to a number of people. So I'm not sure my fearless leader, Dean Smith, is going to want to share me that much, but it's fine with me. Usually what happens is some people will come to our meeting when we're doing them face-to-face, and then I get re-invites to present the talks, which is great by me because, you know, it's no more work to present it after the research has been done. And I've done also daughters and sons in Civil War, and even for that matter, Revolutionary War. So I'm retired. I'm happy to do the talks or share them.
We've got to both George and Jean complimenting you on your presentation, so thank you for that. Peter is asking a question. What was the relationship between Mr. Nicolet and Mr. Haye, two President Lincoln's cabinet members? Were they seen as confidants of the president and therefore kept at arm's length? Do you think that President Lincoln was more trusting of Nicolet Haye than members of his cabinet?
I have no idea on the answer to that one. I would tend to believe, just based on what I read, that Nico's interaction with the cabinet members was probably more or less the appointment secretary job. So who got time with Lincoln? I bet your cabinet members did compared to the people that were downstairs, right? And Haye undoubtedly had a very strong relationship with a lot of the cabinet members. I can't speak to which ones, but part of his job was schmoozing Congress, and schmoozing Congress usually would enlist the help of other cabinet members, depending on the topic. So, and he was more social. I think Nico more or less was, you know, the straight-laced German guy that I can't say went to bed early, but he had a lot of correspondence to take care of and probably kept more or less to himself and did not interact that much with cabinet members. So I'm betting Haye did the heavy lifting there because of the job of being the political liaison.
I'm going to go ahead and take an opportunity to be able to ask a question myself there related to that. Is there any indication that Lincoln had a preference between one or the other?
I think a preference for Haye just in terms of, you know, treating him like a son. Nico was older. Haye was, I'd have to go back and look how old Robert was, but since the two of them hung out, it'd be like you're having a son and then the son's friend, and the friend was funny, witty, you know, and I think it just helped him take his mind off of a lot of stuff.
Okay.
And the fact that they were right there at the end of the hallway in the middle of the night, if you woke up, even better.
So Martha is asking a question here. When Mary Todd Lincoln cut out her staff, did she do it for her own personal gain or to cover the overdrafts and debts?
Can you read that again? I was...
Sure. When Mary Todd Lincoln cut her
Oh,
staff,
yeah.
did she do it to be able to, for her own personal gain or to cover the overdraft and debts?
She was covering her ass on the overdrafts.
Didn't she do that a couple of times though? I mean, I remember hearing things like shopping trips in New York, and she would, you know, completely blow the budget in there for that. So,
well, going back to my comment about the finances, so it turned out that the Lincolns had about $15,000 when they went into the White House, and they had about $85,000 on the day he got assassinated. So out of the $25,000 per year, he actually managed to save a healthy amount of money. So he could have paid that overdraft. I think Mary was just intent on, you know, most of her purchases, although you could argue with that comment, looking at what Judge Davis had to deal with at time of death. You know, I'm sure she said, well, I need 300 pairs of gloves because every day I'm interacting with 100 people and I need the gloves, right? So I think there's always a gray area between official expenses and private expenses, and that's probably true for presidents even today. I mean, I have no idea what the presidents pay for and don't pay for and how much out of their salary they can save, but it looks like they were pretty frugal in their spending patterns on the personal side.
Verda is asking a question. Which helper or secretary did Lincoln share a bed with for 4 years while in Springfield?
I don't think either of the secretaries. I've read stories of while he was on the circuit, you know, traveling around to lawyer the cases that he got. You know, boarding houses, you would share a bed with somebody, but I don't know who all they were. But I don't think he shared beds with the secretary.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, I think that was just not necessarily the same person consecutively. It was just, you know, just the boarding house, just the way that they worked in those days, and just, you know, it's like, oh, you just share a bed with whoever happened to be there, sort of thing. It wasn't that he was sharing a bed with a specific person.
Yeah, it's kind of like youth hostels or something from years ago when I was in Europe.
Except everybody doesn't get a private bed.
Well, you didn't. Yeah, you get your own bed, but it's like 6 people that are like smoking marijuana in Amsterdam or something, right? Unexpected.
Mike is asking a question. Actually, I'm sorry, is just responding to another question regarding where your video could be found. So there's a comment on there if anybody's looking for that. Donna's asking a question. I was lucky to purchase the 12-volume complete works of Abraham Lincoln, edited by Haye and Nicolet. They were listed as the anniversary edition from 1905. Is this the compilation that the men worked on once Robert released all of Lincoln's papers?
I think so.
So there would have been a 10 volume set originally, and then they expanded it with the extra 2 volumes. Is that correct?
I'd have to go back and look, but it's probably the updated version. Let me just pull those slides up and go to that page and see.
Yeah,
if
I mean, you do have it set that had 10 volumes, and then they added an additional 2. I recall that from that point in the presentation.
Oops. Okay, I'm not gonna bother going back to it.
Another question in here. It just is actually just more comments on your previous. A lot of more interest in. I mean, we're listening to a great presentation that you did this evening. A lot of comments on your previous presentation, so there's been some commentary in there for that. But those are the questions that we currently have in the chat area. If there's any other questions, please feel free to be able to unmute yourself on your mic. Or if you want to be able to post another question in the chat, I'll be happy to read those as well.
I put in the chat, I don't use Facebook. So how am I going to see any recording?
Well, there are some other comments in there about that, about how to get that. And if you look at the comments in there, Mike Hoover
There's
did
so many,
make a couple of.
There's so many. What is the answer?
May I answer that?
Absolutely.
Yes, just on the internet, any computer, just search for Facebook. When
But I
you-
don't do Facebook, my love. I don't do Facebook.
You don't need an account. You can just search Facebook. And when it comes up, you'll be able to search for the Inland Empire Civil War Roundtable. And once you get there, which is just 2 steps, you can see it. If you want the slides, if you'll email our email address, I'll send you the slides, or Dr. Schrader can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I apologize. My style. Some people like it. I think some people get annoyed because I basically, when I did the research, I put everything together in PowerPoint. I used to do marketing, so that's kind of the standard way of capturing information. And then I add pictures where I can find them, and then I go through and I edit it. So the idea is a pretty complete set of information about the topic, but when I present, it's actually, you're not seeing all the slides that I have on that. I try to pick out the best ones that I think are the most interesting stories that maybe you haven't heard before. So hopefully it worked. I try not to go too fast. You can't get the general gist of it, but that's the style. But I recognize for some people, they probably want to go back and reread it and read every word if you're really into that particular topic. So that's been the style.
Actually, what I did enjoy, though, is that you were actually interactive and were asking questions that you had posted on there that generally speaking, and in fact, we have not had any other presenters do that. So I had actually disabled the microphones for everybody because I wasn't expecting that. So I've obviously changed that so we could have some interaction, but it was great to be able to have that because we don't have that, unfortunately, having Zoom for the last couple of years. We've lost that ability to be able to see face to face and to be able to do some of those things. So it was great to be able to do that.
Right. Yeah, it's my meager attempt at making it more interactive, even though it's virtual.
And I see, David, you have another question there. Go ahead.
Could I make another comment? I may be a little fuzzy on this, but I think one of the interesting things about David Davis was when the 1876 election came about, and there was all the controversy about Hayes and Tilden, and it didn't really get settled till a couple of days before the inauguration. When they set up the committee to decide how the contested states were going to be decided, I think it was a 15-member committee, and they had people from Congress and the Senate and so forth, and they had it divided 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. And they felt that the one person who would be fair and open and unbiased was David Davis. So they nominated him to the committee, and he evidently didn't want anything to do with it. So he promptly resigned and went back to Illinois and was appointed by the Illinois legislature, because they didn't elect senators in those days, as the senator from Illinois. So then it became very political again, and we all know what happened. But I think that's accurate and kind of interesting for this guy who is perhaps the biggest political person we've ever had in the United States, even more than William Howard Taft.
One thing, the Athertons, Anne was on here commenting about getting COVID earlier. They're in my LA Civil War Roundtable, and they'll tell you I take great delight in the face-to-face meetings of doing a little segue on some things never change. So, for example, that committee on the conduct of the war with the congressional hearings and bringing people up and tormenting them, some things never change. Somebody asked where I'm at. I live in Hermosa Beach, California. So south of the LA airport, about 5 miles at the beach.
And just as a sidebar comment, I think between David and your comment on David Davis, myself and Dr. Dave here, we've got to get a few more Daves into the program here. I think we just don't have enough Davids here.
Yep. Yeah.
Other comments, questions from anybody that we'd like to be able to ask our presenter this evening? I'm not hearing any comments from my wife. She usually has some comments that she wants to be able to ask. Not sure if she's prepared any or not this evening. She's not commenting.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your questions and for listening. Hopefully you got something out of it. And I might see you down the road for another presentation I do.
I do want to say thank you for that. It certainly is, like you said, so many of us hear so many of the same stories over and over again about the Civil War. It's always a delight to be able to hear something about it that is not something that you hear every day, and to be able to hear a different piece of news or information in there. I do see a couple of other people that just came on, and I don't know, Nick, if you have any that just turned their cameras on. I don't know if they had any comments or questions on there, or if Nick, if you want to make any commentary before we close out here.
No, I just wanted to remind people to check the announcements for next month's meeting, and we'll have news on the various other things, some of them coming up then, some of them not till the March meeting, but we'll see you in a month.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we leave? I see a couple of other people just turned on their cameras there. I don't know if they had any questions or not.
Yeah, I turned my camera on only because I needed to at least let you know I'm here. Hi, Dave.
You're doing right.
My wife and I have been laid down real low with this COVID nonsense, and we've been tested positive, so we're hunkering down like everyone else. But I'm quite familiar with Nicolet and Haye and their various things they went through with handling Abraham Lincoln's daily challenges, I should put it. But I am hoping to someday get back to where we can get to face-to-face and really confer with each other, because I've always had a lot of questions asked, but tonight I just simply don't. I'm too tired, too exhausted.
You take care of yourself.
Oh, yes, I will do that. And you too, yourself.
Yeah.
And Janet, I do see that you have your hand up there as well.
Oh, thank you, Dave. I just wanted to announce that our sister Civil War Roundtable, Inland Empire, is going to be having their next meeting on Wednesday, February 2nd at 6:30. It will be a Zoom-only meeting, and the topic, they will turn themselves into a real round table, and they will be having an actual roundtable discussion among attendees on the hypothetical question, what if Pickett's charge had been successful? So you can get their Zoom link off of our newsletter, or you can write to us at Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, CWRT @gmail.com, and I can send you that link directly. But we hope you will support their meetings as well.
Thank you, Janet. All right. Well, if there's no other comments or questions, I want to just thank everybody for their time. We will post this. I do promise, Janet, I haven't forgotten. I've got the other recordings. I'm going to get those to you. I haven't forgotten that. And we'll try to get that taken care of. But thanks everybody for your time here, and have a good evening, and we'll see you again next month.
Everybody.